The EU, as you both probably know, has been the most affected by its participation in the Ukraine proxy war, in the US's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. Now it's getting caught up in Taiwan. So Macron was just in Beijing not too long ago, earlier this month, where he distanced himself from the US's policy around Taiwan. He affirmed the one China principle. A lot of people suspect he's not the most genuine of people, and I think his record kind of speaks to that. But now you have the EU, Josep Borrell, this foreign, like the Europe's foreign minister, so to speak, calling for the EU countries to send warships to Taiwan, kind of following along the United States' path. Ali, maybe we can turn to you. What do you make of this, and how do you understand this?
I mean, it's madness. These people don't learn. First of all, I mean, they had been instigating conflict between Ukraine and Russia for years. We know, I don't want to go into all that history, but we know how the EU and the US were behind the 2014 coup in Kiev. They were literally, the EU ambassadors, along with Victoria Nuland, were taking part in the so-called Maidan protests. And so they orchestrated that coup. They armed Ukraine for years. They supported the war against people in the east, in Donbass, and they were, salivating for this war. So when Russia entered Ukraine in February of 2022, clearly, at least in hindsight, it's very clear that this was, in a sense, a bluff from the Russians. They wanted to show how serious they were. They didn't intend, I mean, this is my reading, to occupy the whole of Ukraine. They were trying to get a negotiation going, and they had already been betrayed on the Minsk agreements, which would have resolved the issue in Ukraine. And we've recently had confirmation from Angela Merkel and from the former French President François Hollande that the Western side, the European side, never took the Minsk agreement seriously. I think the Russians wanted to essentially scare the Ukrainians into finally signing a deal, and they got, or keeping to a deal, let's say, and they got to that point with the negotiations in Istanbul in March of 2022. But then NATO blew it all up. They said, no way will we allow you to negotiate a settlement to this war, because this is our chance to get Russia. This is what we've been waiting for. This is what we've been building up for. And the problem when you believe your own propaganda that, oh, Russia isn't a real country, that its army is all corrupt and poorly trained and starving and what have you, is that you make enormous miscalculations. And that's what they did getting into this war. It turns out that the Europeans and even the United States, with its $900 billion defense budget, is not set up to fight an old-fashioned long land war. Similar to what Lowkey said about Israel, but on a bigger scale. Israel can't fight long wars because it has to take people out of its civilian economy because it's a reserve army. So they have to shut down the whole economy to fight a war. So the Israeli doctrine has always been short wars on our own terms, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum. This is on a larger scale what's happening with Europe and the United States. They don't have the artillery shells. They don't have the tanks. They don't have the air defenses to fight a long war against Russia. And they're learning that the hard way now. And so amid all this, you're going to pick a fight with China over Taiwan? And you want to tell me that is just not sheer madness? Why are they doing it? There is no issue over Taiwan. All of them agree, the United States, the European Union, and every country on the planet except for, what is it now, Guatemala and a couple of other very tiny countries. They all agree that Taiwan is part of China, number one. And number two, that the People's Republic of China is the only legal government of China. That's not me saying that. That's what the State Department says. That's what the European Union policy is on paper. China has never shown that it is interested in reintegrating Taiwan into China by force. It has never shown that. On the contrary, what we've seen, the consistent policy has been to integrate economically. And this can be shown by the enormous growth of trade and investment between mainland China and Taiwan. The only factor that brings the military equation in is the foreign meddling, particularly the American meddling, but now also the EU. Joseph Borrell and whose navy is going to go to Taiwan? I mean, the European navies, they have a few ships. Great, they have a few ships. But the idea, what are they going to do? If they successfully provoke a war across the Taiwan Strait, as they have provoked and instigated war in Ukraine, a European army is going to go and rescue Taiwan? A European navy is going to go and rescue Taiwan? No, they're not. So what's going to happen is another country is going to be destroyed. People are going to die for nothing. This is insanity. But I also think it is the death throes of a dying empire. They see their power diminishing globally, and they're lashing out in every direction. It's like they want to still prove to themselves, I've still got it. You know, I can still go anywhere in the world and subdue anyone. You can't anymore. And if these delusional people in Brussels and Washington think China is going to take any of this lying down, I mean, we say it all the time, but you can imagine the reaction if China were to send its brand new aircraft carrier Fujian to the English Channel or to the North Sea or to the Gulf of Mexico, or park it off of New York Harbor, what the reaction would be. And yet they think it's the most natural thing in the world for them to go and interfere on the other side of the world in a situation where nobody asked them to, they can do no good, and there is no problem except them.
Lowkey, do you have anything to add?
Absolutely. You know, we are witnessing the convulsions of a dying narcissistic empire, which is constantly speaking in terms way beyond its means and projecting its capabilities in a kind of imagined world, which is increasingly out of touch with the reality. When we look at the way the United States has driven what has happened in Ukraine, you actually can look at the very same year that it invaded Iraq. In 2003, the very same time that US troops were on the ground in Iraq, they established something in Ukraine called the NATO Ukraine Civic League. Now, this was a NATO-funded project to establish NGOs across the country that could astroturf the idea that membership in NATO was a panacea to all of the problems in Ukrainian society. You also had the NATO info stands, which were set up at all of the major universities in the country and libraries and municipal buildings across the country in order to proselytize for the NATO deity. And what has that led to now? Well, we've got a situation where Lockheed Martin have increased their stock value by 37%, Northrop Grumman by 41%, Raytheon 17%, General Dynamic 19%. We see Ukraine being divvied up in these lend-lease arrangements, whereby it's costing something like $3 billion a month to prop up the Ukrainian economy. Of course, all of that is music to the ears of BlackRock, to the World Bank, to the IMF and JP Morgan. And that is exactly what is happening. Now, when you look at the United States vis-a-vis Taiwan, the US refuses to accept that China, in the space of 30 to 40 years, you look at the point in the early 80s, China's GDP was literally 10 to 15% of the US GDP. Every year since then, it's increased by 10% until COVID. And the United States is struggling greatly with the economic equilibrium of the world returning to a more natural setting. When we look at the year that the East India Company was founded, we actually see that the amount of Britain produced just 1.8% of world GDP, and as far as 1750, India and China accounted for 75% of world industrial output. Now, historically, there have been at least 4 to 5 periods of human history when China has been the most advanced nation in the world. And so what actually is happening is the aberration of history, which was the British Empire, in which economic power was divvied up to a smaller section of humanity, is now becoming closer to a more natural kind of equilibrium. And the United States is doing everything it can to avoid that. And it is willing to sacrifice Taiwan at the kind of a shrine to US former glory as the imperial ruler of the waves. But it's just not going to be possible. Think about the madness, and madness is the exactly correct term to use for it. When they're getting Australia to have nuclear powered submarines, poor Australia. They elected Gough Whitlam, who merely wanted to redistribute some of the economic power in the society, who wanted a slightly fairer society for the indigenous Aboriginal population, who wanted the US out of Pine Gap. And what did the US do? They overthrew Gough Whitlam in Australia. And now Australia is actually being asked to go to war with China for the United States. This is absolute madness. And anybody in their right mind, I would say actually that war with China would be far more widely opposed, even across a lot of the business classes in the West, because many of them have understood clearly. You look at Rishi Sunak when he was going back and forth with Liz Truss to be the Conservative Party leader. Liz Truss was clearly given a briefing that came from US intelligence, which said that Rishi Sunak was soft on China, and she used that to rail against him. The British political elite wanted to sign the deal with Huawei. They wanted that to happen. The US came in and whipped them into shape in order to not do that. So there's great swaths of humanity that understand, when you're looking at China, you are talking about 1.4 billion people. That is 1/5 of the world's population. And many people in the world are deeply opposed to this ridiculous war game that the US and its quaint sock puppet Britain are attempting to play with China. I would argue certainly the French and the Germans will not. The Germans seem like they are, but I don't think overall that people see this as a clear-minded policy.
And I think it's so important to emphasize what you said about the changing economics, because if you think about it, in 1945, the United States represented about 50% of global GDP. The US was the one power. Yes, of course, the US did take part in World War II, but it didn't suffer the kind of devastation and death that, for example, Europe did, or especially the Soviet Union, which sacrificed more than 25 million of its citizens to defeat the Nazis. And the United States was an incredible industrial power. It was, to use the cliche, the arsenal of democracy. That is, as they would call it, it was the arsenal of Jim Crow and the arsenal of British imperialism, but they called it the arsenal of democracy. Today, that's not the case. The United States does not have the industrial capacity, to wage a land war on the European continent against Russia by proxy, as it's doing now. But it doesn't even have the industrial capacity to survive the kind of economic war with China that some seem to want. You go into any store in the United States, any general goods store, household goods store, and practically everything is made in China. If we had an economic war with China, we would be lacking basic household goods. It would be a crisis that would be unprecedented in our lifetimes. We'd be talking about the kind of deprivation perhaps people experienced during the Depression. And the same is true in the UK. The same is true across Europe. So you look at where the world's industrial capacity is and where the world's energy supplies are, and indeed where the world's technology is shifting. China and Russia have incredibly complementary economies. Russia has effectively limitless energy supplies and raw materials and minerals, as well as an industrial economy. China has just incredible industrial capacity, but also an incredibly rapidly growing knowledge economy, research-based, science-based, medical-based. What have we got in the West? What is the United States investing in? You look around a city like Chicago, where I am now, and the infrastructure is crumbling. The public transit is falling apart. The schools are underfunded. There are people living under every bridge and underpass. And that's the picture in every major city in the United States. Where is the investment in people? The United States is not investing in its own people and its own society, let alone building infrastructure around the world like China is. So look at where this is going. It's not very hard to figure out. It's not very hard to figure out that why I'm sure you've all seen the video when a German official goes to lecture the president of Namibia about his country becoming too close with China. President Hage Geingob of Namibia will respond and say, why do you come here and keep lecturing us about China? The Chinese didn't come and colonize us. They're building schools and hospitals. That's the story all around the world. And this kind of, I can't remember if it was Danny or Lowkey who used the term narcissism of the West, that you think if you come in and give a high-flying speech about democracy and apple pie, that everyone is going to be, oh, wow, these people are amazing. No, people want schools. They want roads. They want infrastructure. They want ports. They want solar panels. They want wind farms. And this is what they're getting from China. And of course, the way this is portrayed in the media here, the lies about, that China is putting these countries into a debt trap. It's all projection, because that is what the West did after formal decolonization in the 50s and 60s. They put this global South into a debt trap. There was more, those countries were kept poor. They could not build up their infrastructure. They could not fulfill the promises of independence and the optimism and hope that came after decolonization, because they had to pay these debts to the loan sharks in London and New York and the IMF and the World Bank, which turned from direct, outright colonialism to neo-colonialism. And we are now living in an era where formal decolonization is turning into real decolonization, because ultimately you cannot have sovereignty and independence without economic sovereignty. And this is how the world, I think, is changing. And I don't claim to be an expert on any of these topics, but it's impossible not to see the changes that are happening.